Welcome to Pete Antonellis' Wednesdays with Workers, hosted by the American Labor Museum. Today we are going to be interviewing Dan Antonellis, who is the director of the UAW Region 9 Housing Corporation. And UAW stands for United Automobile, Aerospace, Agricultural Implement Workers of America, which covers the United States, Canada, and Puerto Rico. Hi, Dan, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, and thank you for having me.
So our program is called Pete Antonellis' Wednesdays with Workers, and you're going to help us learn a little bit about your dad. Could we start out by having you tell us how he became a member of the UAW?
Sure. He began working in the 50s, I think 1954, in Bendix in Teterboro, New Jersey, in the aerospace division. And he was a tool maker, tool and die maker, machinist. And he worked there actually for about 20 years. But it was a huge UAW plant. There were at one point 8,000 workers, and another 8,000 workers in the union, and at one point there were 12,000 people who worked there. And he got active in the union, became a shop steward, and along the time became a chief steward, and then he was on the bargaining committee, chairman of the bargaining committee, and he would negotiate the contracts and do grievances and hearings and things like that. Became very, very active in it.
So I imagine while you were growing up as a young boy, you were exposed to a great deal about the union movement.
We were. I have two older brothers. We were, and I have very vivid memories of going to union meetings and being there. And there were other kids. Other parents took their kids to the union meetings, and yeah, I could remember even where they were. It's funny, all these years later. And I was at a strike once with him at job action. Yeah, it's looking back on it, I guess it was unusual, but at the time it just seemed like what people did. I didn't know.
I understand completely. So were you able to understand how the union benefited your dad and your family? And if so, what were the benefits of your father's union membership?
Well, there were tons of benefits. I guess for him, part of what it was is he was the youngest of his siblings. There were 5 of them, and they grew up during the Depression. He was the youngest, but during World War II, he was the only one of his brothers that was still home, and his father passed away during 1945, and he had to start working full time to support his family, and his mother, and his help with his sisters and everything. And he had seen a lot. My grandfather had gotten hurt working on the Lincoln Tunnel, and walked with a limp for the later part of his life as a result of it. And he had tough times at work. He was an immigrant, in an Italian neighborhood in New York City, and they were poor. And I guess, that sort of had a lot to do with the way he walked into it. I mean, he left after high school. He went and he joined the National Guard, and he worked for Gristedes in New York City, and then he went to school and he became a machinist, and he worked in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And it wasn't until the 50s, as I said, that he came and worked in New Jersey. But by the time he got to Bendix, I think that the union for him was like sort of finding out that there were other people who struggled, and there was a way to make life better. And these were all things he had seen, and people had similar backgrounds, and there were people in Bendix who had escaped Germany during the war and had come to work at Bendix because they escaped Hitler and things like that. So I think Bendix, for him, he had worked other places, but this was the first time he actually got to see, like, it was sort of a brotherhood and the union that brought these people together who had struggled and had seen their parents struggle. And there was now a mechanism in place to sort of change things and improve things. And, you know, for him, it created this middle-class life that no one had ever had in his family before. And certainly for us, you know, for us, his kids, we learned all this, and we learned, you know, about organizing and, you know, about all the challenges there were. But he was able to have us go to school and go to college and things like that, and, you know, support a middle-class family. And it was all because of the union, all of it. So, you know, it meant a lot to him, and I think he understood what it meant in the bigger picture, in society, in you know, progressive programs and progressive politics, all became part of it. The UAW is really big till even today, about educating its members and understanding more than just what happens on the shop floor or wherever you work. So I think I answered your question.
Certainly, and
Yeah.
you mentioned progressive ideas of the union, and I know that your position has to do with the housing corporation. How did that all begin? What is this housing corporation that you manage?
So back in 1970 and earlier, also, there were several auto plants in the New Jersey and in the tri-state area. And there was an auto plant in Mahwah, Ford plant. And it had, I want to say, like 5,500 members. And no one who worked in the plant lived anywhere near there. There were 50 people who lived in Mahwah who worked in the plant, and all of them were upper level management. No one that worked for Ford lived anywhere near Upper Bergen County. And it was actually a problem for Ford also. They had van pools. People took vans from New York City, from South Jersey, from Central Jersey. And several developers wanted to build up in that area because there was obviously a market for small homes. And towns like Mahwah and other towns, but Mahwah in particular, didn't want working people there. And majority of them were, you know, Black or Hispanic, and they absolutely didn't want them there. So, sorry. So they didn't want people like this there. I'm sorry. And so what happened is that the UAW decided it was going to step in and form this company, and they were going to do their own building for workforce housing. And they did it at the time. Marty Gerber was a regional director in Region 9, and he did this understanding that it would be a legal process, and they were going to challenge these actions in court. They were challenging what now is known as exclusionary zoning. At the time, it didn't really have a name, but what these towns were doing were zoning and for making large lot requirements, 1 acre and 2 acre lot requirements, to force builders to only build big houses and houses that working people couldn't afford. So the UAW went in with this corporation and said, okay, we're going to build and we're going to do this housing. And at the same time, there was a similar situation going on in Mount Laurel, New Jersey. And the difference there was a bunch of people living there who Mount Laurel was trying to push out. They were zoning for people who were already, zoning out people who already had lived there. So I guess, you know, they had joined forces with the NAACP and other groups. And at some point, the decision was made that the Mount Laurel case was a better case to walk through the courts. So the UAW stepped back and Mount Laurel went forward, and if you live in New Jersey, you know all about Mount Laurel. There were landmark decisions and about fair share housing, and cities and towns across New Jersey having their share of affordable housing. And UAW was in the forefront of that. And it had started with the Mawa thing. So what happened was that the UAW, after a step back, said, well, now we have this corporation for housing. So what are we going to do? And they decided to sponsor Section 8 housing that the government was putting together at the time from, this is like the early 1970s. So they sponsored a bunch of projects for senior housing throughout New Jersey. And in New Brunswick, North Brunswick, Irvington, East Orange. And this all happened through the 70s and through the 80s. And now there's 1,250 apartments. There's 10 properties. And it's its own nonprofit that supports itself and provides really nice housing, affordable housing. All through the early years, it was supported, the UAW funded it and provided all the seed money and staffing of it. So I always make a point of reminding people that, the reason they're here, not only people that live here, but the people that work here. The reason they're here is because of dues from working people back in the 60s and 70s, because it was the UAW's money that did this,
Right.
for now, and we still have a good relationship with the UAW. We have UAW people on our executive board, but we're an independent nonprofit.
Excellent. Now, your dad and Marty Gerber, who you mentioned earlier, were they officers I know that Marty was an officer. Your father was an officer in the union at that time? And if so, how did he run for office, and what's the story behind that?
So when he was in Bendix in Local 153 of the UAW, you ran as a shop steward, you ran as chief steward, and everything was very competitive. There were just so many people. And then besides the president and vice president, the typical positions in the local, there was a bargaining committee. And they sort of ran the nuts and bolts of negotiating the contract, but also administering it and maintaining it and making sure it was being enforced. And he got on the bargaining committee and ran for a position. And then he ran as the chair of the bargaining committee. And I guess it was a powerful position. It was a meaningful position for him. And it also, one story in particular is it raised an opportunity, I think, for him to apply some of the progressive things he believed in. So I want to say in 1969, if not, it was 68 or 70, but people ran on tickets together. There were groups that would run together. And he ran on a ticket with a man who I remember, a black man. And it was very controversial at the time, and no one else would run with him. Usually a ticket would have 4 or 6 people. His ticket had 2. And I was 8 or 9 years old at the time. And it was a very, very close election. In the plant that I said had 12,000 people at one point, he won by 6 votes. They won by 6 votes. And it was crazy. It was horrible, really. I mean, looking back on it now, I mean, his car was destroyed. A lot of things happened. At the time, it didn't make any sense to me because the plant was full of minorities, and I used to see people at union meetings. No one ever thought anything of it, but somehow, I don't know, it's too much to explain. But anyway, he ran, and it was a big deal. And the fellow's name was Don Barbie, and his son, Mark, is actually an officer in the UAW today. And he had sort of grown up. He's a little younger than me, but he had sort of come up the way I did. And we both remember that time. It's interesting. But something that seems, I guess we've moved forward, because something that seems so sort of normal today was really a big issue then. You know, people argued over it and fought over it and thought he was nuts and just crazy things, you know.
You
And
certainly,
it's a long time ago, but it's not that long ago, you know.
yeah, no, the late 60s and what we're seeing today are quite comparable. I could say that, that's for sure. Right. So your father was so courageous and forthright, and I always admired him. And you grew up at a time, and so did I, when unionism was so strong. In the 50s, 35% of the membership, 35% of workers were in unions. So now we have the global market, and many of the industrial union jobs have moved overseas, where the cost of labor is a fraction of those that were in America. If those jobs return to the States, do you foresee a surge in union membership again, and why or why not?
I mean, I do. And I think in some ways, I feel like we haven't done enough in the labor movement to sort of talk about ourselves and take credit for things and advertise ourselves, because I think that people just associate the unions with sort of industrial jobs, and this was a big deal with my father. It's more than that, and it's about being a worker, and almost everyone's a worker. Teachers are workers. There's professionals who are workers, and they all need to sort of join together on some level and support each other and support themselves. It just levels the playing field. And when I ended up working for the state for a lot of years, and they're unionized with the CWA, and it was a big deal, mostly professionals, but we understood that. And somehow I think that got lost on folks, and they just think that, well, if you're going to work in a factory, then you might be in a union, and it may or may not be a good idea. But as workers, I think we have more in common with people in China and Japan and all these places, in Mexico, who do the same jobs that people do here and make a lot less money. So I think, yeah, if jobs come back here, as we hope they do, and people are conscious of where they're buying things, I think there will be a growth in unionism. But I also think that, my father had this thing that I've heard all over, that management is the best organizer. And there's some truth to that. There's a lot of truth to that. And I think what we've seen for the past, 35 years or so, I think a new generation of people are understanding that you have to organize, you have to band together. And I think that's some of what we saw in the last few years. And I think it's important for the labor movement to talk about its roots and where that came from. And it's also important to tap into it. So that's what I'm hopeful for going forward, is that, we get our story out there. Because I think it's a story of working people, and it's the same story of people struggling and trying to make it all work, from Black Lives Matter to all the other sort of progressive things that are happening today. I think it's all part of the same story.
Well, I think that that's a really excellent note to end on, because it's a hopeful note. And if there's anything more that you'd like to add before we close, you're welcome to do so.
Well, so I guess the only thing I guess it's sort of been said here, but my father, he passed away in October, this past October. He was 91. And he had a defined benefit pension for all the years he was retired. And he had health benefits and a defined benefit pension, and it gave him a meaningful retirement, and it gave him freedom and security, and they were all things that would have never been there without his union, and things we would have never had. And I think that people don't realize that today, and the kind of retirement plans we have now, largely are not as secure as the ones that people got through their unions. And I think he, you know, he was sort of proof of a life well lived, if you will, and a struggle, and you know, making it worth it. And I hope that through programs like this, people see that it's really the way to go, you know, to be an activist. I think he would.
We were all blessed by the life of Pete Antonellis, and now we're blessed by the life of his son, Dan. Thank you very, very much, Dan.
Okay, thank you.
Solidarity forever, for the union makes us strong.
Right. Thank you.